Okay, so yeah, it's a little bit different because we're back a bit, but you're good.
Okay.
In frame?
I'm there.
You learn a new term today. All right, so yeah, just move the mic up to your face, and you can move the mic anywhere you want to.
Okay.
You're free to, you can basically just not break it.
Okay.
So it's fine.
All right, that's fine.
Okay, greetings, hello, how goes it? This is the Cube LA podcast. I know, I haven't done an episode in a few weeks. My apologies. As a heads up, the last interview of the year will be with Dr. Donald Brown. We will discuss the connection between mental health and our current justice system. I'm very excited for that episode. And speaking of excited, I'm excited for today. I have with me Sarah Godoy. Am I saying your last name properly?
Yeah.
Starting off the interview strong. Started off strong. Okay. I don't have any other updates, so we can just dive right into the show. Are you ready to begin?
Let's do it.
Okay. Okay. Is it okay if I call you Sarah?
Of course.
Just making sure. Okay. So you're a very busy lady.
Very busy. Very tired all the time.
You received your bachelor's in poli-sci and women's studies in 2010 from UC Riverside. You received your master of social welfare from UCLA in 2015, and you are currently working on your PhD in social work all the way on the other side of the country in North Carolina.
Yep.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay. You have written you are currently on numerous editorial boards regarding child abuse, violence against women, and human trafficking. And you've written numerous articles, given numerous presentations. So basically, if I want to learn about what I'll call horrific topic of sex trafficking, you are the person I should go to, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. We're in the right place.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's my area.
So I'll tell you what, we're going to start off at a very basic level. Okay. My very first question for you is, how do you define sex trafficking?
Sure. So in the United States, we have the cornerstone of human trafficking legislation, which includes both labor and sex trafficking. Mm-hmm. So my area of expertise is really sex trafficking, but it is important to note that there are various forms of human trafficking, including labor and organ trafficking. So here in the U.S., we define sex trafficking of adults differently than we do of children. So for adults, we define it as using force, fraud, or coercion to induce a person over the age of 18 or 18 or older into commercial sexual activity for anything of value. Mm-hmm. So that could be food, shelter, money. Commercial sex acts could be pornography, transactional sex, and even survival sex. For children, we have an important caveat. So we in the United States legally define sex trafficking as inducing any minor age 17 and below into any type of commercial sexual activity in exchange for anything of value. So importantly, minors do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. They don't have to prove that they've crossed state lines. They don't have to prove that they have a trafficker. Basically, if a minor is engaging in any type of sexual activity and they are receiving something, whether it be, food, basic needs, a higher status in, or a grade or something like that, they are deemed trafficked.
See, this is why you're here. We were talking about this before the show started, how broad of a topic sex trafficking or human trafficking is. I actually sat in on a lecture that I only got about an hour's worth of, and the stuff that you just listed off there, I feel like there needs to be at least a week's worth of material.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah. I think we try to distill it down the best we can and give folks kind of, pockets of information that can be absorbed. But the reality is that you listen to one podcast or you attend one training, and there's just no way that you could ever learn all of the nuances in that time frame. And so I think it's important to have these foundational conversations, but really the work begins once you walk away from there. So, if you learn something and you're interested or you see something, I would really press upon people that it takes the steps of learning more, to engaging in dialogue, to understand what the policies and protocols in their own workspace and their field would be to responding to something like sex trafficking.
Yeah, my interest came from that. Bring the mic close to you like this. My interest came from that 1 hour that I had, but I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I mean, if it was not for me being in that field, the knowledge that I would have had about it would have been from the movie Taken or something like that.
Right.
But how did you get involved in the field or interested in the field? How'd you come to that?
Yeah. 2 points. One, before I start to talk about how I became involved, I think exactly what you're saying is so true, is that, you were able to learn a snippet of what sex trafficking is through your training.
Yeah.
But we know that there is no standardized training across the United States, across healthcare providers, across service providers in general, or a standard of care. And so when you're working with this population, oftentimes folks who are the points of contact that could very much intervene and identify what's happening, they're not having this training. And so that is why so often folks who are trafficked really slip under the radar and go under or unidentified. So I think it's really important that we develop standards of training and standards of care so that folks, especially healthcare system folks, child welfare, juvenile justice, judicial system, all of these systems where these folks are intersecting, need to have more conversations, more appropriate trainings, and again, that standard of care.
So even though it's a very broad and actually large problem and topic, people know very little about it.
Definitely. And you might know something, you might suspect something, but oftentimes service providers say that they feel ill-equipped to make a referral or to even call it sex trafficking, even if those indicators and signs are very clearly there. But yeah, so I entered the field in 2014. I was very privileged to be selected to do an international internship in grad school at UCLA. And I went to India, and we had a connection with the University of Delhi. My heart's still in India very much. I get really excited when I talk about it.
Yeah.
So we had the opportunity to do site visits of 6 different social enterprises and nonprofits working with vulnerable populations. And the very last one, the one that I selected, was a nonprofit. They're still in existence, Katha. They do really important work, and they're really the only nonprofit in the red light district in Delhi, India. And so they provide services both to the women who are in brothels, most of whom were sex trafficked into those positions, and their children who live alongside them in the brothels. And so, I was in India over a summer, and every day we would trek to the brothels and we would go to this nonprofit. And I remember thinking, in undergrad, I founded a feminist club, very active, very much wanted to work against violence against women, and did a lot of consciousness raising events and really felt like I had a lot of agency. And then I would step off the metro and I would walk in this place where I couldn't look men in the eyes. And very clearly our instructions were, do not look a man in the eyes while you're in GB Road, while you're in the red light district, because that's an indicator that they could do what they want to you. And there was this fear because these sex buyers were there to buy sex. And so being the only nonprofit in the area, we had to also take precautions, right? And so we had to abide by their social policy and their codes. And so we would go to the brothels and we would do these visits. And I remember staring at the floor and staring at the ceiling because I couldn't look men in the eyes.
Right.
And there was one time in particular where, there's a couple times that really call out to me, but there was this one time where this trafficker, this pimp, quote unquote, he was talking to one of the little girls who we basically did English classes and some, arts and crafts and different types of activities with the youth. And so this one little girl, she was about 9 years old, and he's asking her a question, and I couldn't understand because they were speaking Hindi, and he touches her face. And the way that he looked at her looked like he wanted to eat her.
9
was
years
my
old?
thought. I said to one of the fellow interns, I said, "What are they talking about right now? Can you hear?"
Yeah.
He spoke English, and he said, he's asking where another little girl is, a little girl who's only 5 years old. And I said, why does he want to know where she is? She's 5 years old. What would he have to do with her? And so, they are a community and they're a network in some way, right? So because those quote unquote pimps go in and out of the brothels, and those kids live there. So as their moms are engaging in commercial sex, those children are going in and out of the brothels because those are their homes. And so I just remember thinking, the way I felt powerlessness in those scenarios. But then at the same time, I remembered thinking but I get to walk away and I get to feel safe. I get to go to an air-conditioned Airbnb, and I'm only taking a metro there. My life isn't living in these places. And if I don't dedicate the rest of my life to serving kids like this, women who are dealing with these things, to raising awareness, that I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, And so that happens. It was a really emotional summer. And then I come back and I work with kids in Los Angeles. And these kids bought and sold throughout the U.S., born in the United States, part of the juvenile justice system, part of the child welfare system, accessing services through a local LA-based nonprofit called Saving Innocence. And, again, it's these really horrific, heartbreaking stories. And all throughout all of it, if I zoom out and take a look at those experiences, I really was most struck by the resilience and also the amount of hope that existed, even in this darkness, and even in a lot of really evil, scenarios that you hear about. But these kids encouraging each other, no, be happy. It's okay. It's going to be okay. You already lived through the worst. You're going to be okay. And so I think that, when you have the opportunity to sit face to face and to, be in this position with children, minors who have already lived through more than you can ever even dream of, it just sparks something that
I can see it.
Wants and need to do more.
I can see it. People, you might be listening at home, so you can't see it, but your face kind of lit up when you started talking about India, when you started talking about helping people. No, that's no, I can understand. You were sort of in the environment that where you would be touched in that manner. Yeah. So you described somewhere other than the United States. And I actually think that people in the United States have this issue with imagining other places outside of the United States. We actually have an issue imagining places in the United States that are outside of our own atmosphere, personal atmosphere.
Right.
Do you feel that the people of the United States that are not involved in these situations, do you feel as though we're all taking it seriously, or that we how do you feel that we're approaching people that are in situations like you just described?
I don't think taking it seriously. I think people know that it's a serious and grave issue. And when they hear about it or they see about it, I think people feel really angry and upset. And, I'll facilitate a training, and then people come up after and they're angry, and they're well, if I ever met a trafficker, I would do this, or they all deserve to die, or, all of these really impassioned responses. And so I don't think it's a matter of taking it seriously. I think it's a matter of knowing and understanding that it's more prevalent than what we think it is. And it's almost we're all so busy, and we all have our blinders on of what it is that we care about and we're passionate about. And sometimes it feels like adding something so heavy like sex trafficking, it's too much. It's too much, right? I have enough to worry about. I don't need to worry about the children who are, being bought and sold for sex. But
in another country.
But, it is very much here. And oftentimes we see it, we see indicators, and we have this response of, my stomach turns, something's uneasy, but I don't know what it is, And so I think that having just a little bit of information and taking action, not, being the person that intervenes, But trying to get folks involved who are in a position to help, I think, is really important and critical, because it is here. It is in every community in the United States. It doesn't matter if it's a rural community, an urban community. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter, there are folks who are more vulnerable to exploitation, but we know that really it crosses socioeconomic lines and it crosses races and cultures. Exploitation, unfortunately, is embedded in every, place in this country, in this world. There's no immune community from it. Yeah. And so it might look, and it does look different, depending on where you are, it's going to look very different. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that we probably don't know what we're looking at.
And I imagine that happens quite a bit in doctors' offices and.
Yeah. I mean, I think we don't understand the importance if we think about service providers, the importance of trauma-informed care. And, oftentimes, and, if we think about the healthcare professionals or doctors in particular, it's typically, historically, very paternalistic, right? And so it's like, well, the doctor says, and you follow the orders, and they're just going to do what they have to do, and you have to comply. But we know that people with trauma, with histories of trauma, with histories of sexual abuse, they're also going to react in a way. And oftentimes when a young person who's been exploited then reacts to someone who's not employing trauma-informed approaches, they're then deemed as, well, they're just difficult to work with, or they don't want help. But really, from the standpoint of the person who is the service provider, it really, the onus should fall on them, right? The onus should fall on the person who is being paid to provide the service and is being trained to provide the service, and not someone who has had for probably their whole life have had this continuum of abuse, and now they have to sit and just kind of comply. But in terms of, also just seeing these indicators of like when I saw that man touch this child's face, for me, it was like, whoa, there's no boundaries here. Like, I mean, I'm standing in a brothel, but it didn't have to be in a brothel. It could have been anywhere, right? Like, we often see these broken boundaries and folks just kind of look away, right? But one of the biggest antecedents to sex trafficking, or one of the most common and well documented, is childhood sexual abuse. And so seeing some of these indicators early on are really important.
Yeah. Again, I keep going back to this, the training, not having enough training to recognize it, but also being able to approach the patient in a proper way.
Right.
That's also a barrier to patients actually asking for assistance. Would you agree with that?
We shouldn't expect for people to just ask for help, because oftentimes folks who are exploited are trained to not ask for help. They're trained that everyone around them just wants the worst for them, especially if they have a trafficker. The trafficker will instill this fear, this omnipotent presence of, I am everything, I'm taking care of you, and they just want to hurt you. They're going to take you away. They're going to put you in a system that doesn't care about you. All of these things where folks are really, scared to ask for help, scared for their life. It's a self-preservation tactic also, right? Like, some of the things that these folks are encountering, it could be the best psychiatrist and they still wouldn't feel like they're able to disclose. And so I think also recognizing, like, it's the training, but also recognizing, like, some folks aren't at the place where they really feel like they are safe, or they just have so much else happening at the same time that, traffickers are very real. Like, they could put a green light out on you and you could be dead the next day. And so,
could you clarify what green light
so
means?
just like basically saying that anyone and everyone could do whatever they want to that person.
Okay.
Like lighting people on fire, that happens. Shooting people, that happens, right? Killing people. And so there's all of that to say violence is also a very real part of it. But I do think, still, no matter what, we do need better training. We need consistent training. We need, standards of care. We need policies and protocols, because if you have training and your organization doesn't have any kind of policy or protocol to follow up with the training, well, then you as a service provider, will likely still feel ill-equipped to make a referral, to not sure who to report to and things like that.
Yeah, no, I at the last place that I trained, University of Maryland, we did a lot of trauma-informed therapy, trauma-focused therapy. And one of the first things that they teach you is that a trauma victim is not going to react to you the same way another person will.
Right.
Their brains are sort of tuned to pay very close attention to changes in another person's affect. So I might smile at something, right? Or my face might, be straight like it is now, but that trauma victim might interpret that as me being angry.
Right. Yeah. I think also one thing I've learned in working with youth is they will only tell you what they think that you can handle. And so they might have, a really horrific story, but only give you bits and pieces because of your response to them. And so that's also really important, as a researcher, when doing interviews and focus groups, making sure that we have, an environment where folks feel comfortable, where we're not shutting someone down because our responses are like, wow, that's the worst thing ever. When for them, they're like, well, I haven't even gotten to the worst part of the story yet. That was only the introduction. And now I feel like I can't tell you how bad it actually was.
So you have to feel comfortable with that person in order to open up to them.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Which is, I think, really tricky as a researcher. I mean, how do you build rapport so quickly that folks are able to really open up in an hour interview and give you information, right? And so I think there's a lot I could say about that, but it is really tricky.
Yeah, no, it's tough. And I feel comfortable talking to trauma victims. I worked in Baltimore, and I think that is one of those cities that's pretty high up on the list of places where people get trafficked. So I am very concerned, which is one reason why I wanted to talk to you about this, with how many people that don't have any experience at all. I mean, I feel like, again, there's a lot of things that get missed.
Right. I feel like, and not to be like the alarmist, like everyone should be freaking out and everyone should be worried, but like every community should be aware that it is a part of your community. It is, whether the youth are coming or the young adults are coming from your community, or they're going through your community, or they're being sold in your community. So for example, Los Angeles County might have been identified as a place having higher instances of sex trafficking, but we also know that kids and adults from LA County are being trafficked in Orange County, right? Because there's more money and affluence there. And so they might be coming from Compton, but they're being driven to Orange County because, a blowjob might cost something this amount here and it's going to cost more there. And so also, I feel like when we talk about it as like, well, this is the hot spot, it really dilutes from everyone else that's being impacted and affected by it, and like, do we need more services? Yes. But what happens when you go to somewhere like Barstow and it's happening? It's not deemed a hotspot, quote unquote, but there are no services, right? Like if we need to like broaden how we think about it, so that really services could be more widely accessible. So, identification, all of these response mechanisms should be a part of all of the communities, every community, and not just, and I think, talking about it in terms of like, well, this is really happening here. Yes, it is. And there's more people here, but it's also happening in in every other community as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think we spoke about this earlier. Like when it happens to you, that's when people start to care more, Right. And then when you hear about it, you obviously have a reaction to it. But again, there's so many other things going on. But again, when it happens to you, that's when you really care about it. And it's important for people to know that it can happen to you. It can happen no matter how much money you have or how little money you have. It can happen.
Just to...
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
There are some people it will never happen to. Because they are not going to be the person that are being trafficked.
I was going to ask you, what goes into happening or not happening? What would be some factors that contribute to that?
Yeah, I think I'll go kind of group by group. When we think about folks who are sex trafficked, oftentimes we know that it's already vulnerable communities who are being impacted. So, and this is really across the world. Low-income communities that don't have other financial options. We see this in India and other countries. where someone will come and they'll say, hey, we have this job opportunity. Your child can work in a affluent home. They could be the housekeeper. We'll pay them. They can send money back. And then before you know it, they're on a plane going to Texas, and they have been trafficked for the past 10 years.
And the family doesn't even know about it.
Right. And so, but, then that person is cut off from their family. There's no communication. Or if they're allowed to talk, the person who's being trafficked is often, not disclosing information out of fear, because traffickers use tactics like, well, if you say anything, I'm going to kill you. And I know where your family lives, so I'm going to kill them as well. Right. And so out of safety and for the preservation of themselves and family, will not disclose information. So, that could be a tactic, but there's also a lot of other tactics. And I don't think we have time to get into every single one, but we see oftentimes with young girls specifically is that a trafficker will tell them that they love them. They want to be their boyfriend, that they're attracted to them. And they will, have this grooming period where maybe they buy them a cell phone and they're like, well, I got you this phone, but this is just for you and don't tell anyone about it because people are going to be weird that I got you a phone or whatever, but we can talk every day on this. Well, that phone is now this gateway into knowing exactly where that person is every moment of the day, basically, right? And so building this relationship, but by the time that the trafficker says, well, now I need you to go and make us some money because we're a fam and I took care of you and now you have to take care of us.
They're trapped in mentally. Now.
Right. Yeah. So they're mentally, but also, they'll feel indebted. Like, well, he did take care of me. He does love me. He does want the best for us. And maybe I should do this, and that happens really often also. We know that, and not to be like, oh, everyone's snatching people off streets, but kids get snatched off streets too. I sat in an investigation in Los Angeles County, and it was a trafficker who trafficked in total 12 girls. 10 of them were minors. One of them was 18. One of them was 19. One of them was the 19-year-old was pregnant, clearly had signs of Stockholm syndrome. So like a trauma bonding, was in love with the trafficker. 3 of them were 10 years old. And when the investigating officer said, well, how do you know that these are children? Because, well, first of all, he's like, you're a pedophile because you snatch them off the street and then you sodomize every single one of them. But how do you know that they are children? Because if you're driving down the street, you only have one chance to pull a kid who's probably not going to be able to physically fight you back. But if you get a short adult, maybe they could like take you, know?
Right.
And so it took a long time until he answered, but he finally said it was because of the tan pants. And he was specifically saying that he was looking around the local middle school or elementary school where they had school uniforms. And so he was, scoping out those environments and then taking those kids off the street. And so, that's one scenario. But also I worked with a young girl who said her trafficker, literally, she was walking home from school and the trafficker said, hey, you look hungry. Are you hungry? And she's like, yeah, I'm kind of hungry. It's after school. And he's like, oh, if you get in the car, I'll take you to McDonald's. Literally bought her a $1 cheeseburger and trafficked her. And she was like, I got trafficked for a cheeseburger. And when I met her, she was like 16 years old and already a survivor. Right. And
she was snatched at what age?
I don't know exactly, but
years before?
I'm not sure,
okay.
To be honest.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's another thing. Oftentimes when you do work with these young folks, or even when you do research, you're not asking them for their whole life story. Right. Because that's probably not within the purview of what you're doing with them.
Sorry to interrupt. I did ask for a reason, but keep going. You were telling me that she's 16 years old. She just realized she had been trafficked over a cheeseburger. So I interrupted. Go on.
Yeah. So, those are just some of the ways that it happens. We see predominantly people trafficked across, especially in Los Angeles County, but really across the U.S. are going to be youth of color. So right now I'm working on a paper and we're, looking at data and already published data. And the number one identified person that's served in specialty courts that we've identified with empirical data are African American girls. And so we see an overrepresentation of youth of color, not only in systems like the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system, which are often both predecessors to and results of being trafficked, but we see that these young people are then being exploited. And so Youth are particularly vulnerable, often naive because of naivety, maybe having unstable homes, having a history of homelessness or running away from home because of trauma or abuse happening within the home. We see that, a lot of risk factors, which really make for the perfect storm for a trafficker to then, come on in and say, well, I can take care of you. If you, stay with me, then you'll have shelter, you'll have warmth, you'll have, someone who cares about you. And then the next thing they're like being sold online for sex or in the streets.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question.
It answered my question. That you actually gave me about 3 or 4 other ones, but something stood out to me. You described the man that was targeting kids because of the past that they had. What's scary about that, for me at least, is that I think the general public has this idea of people who would do something like this as this maniac that just walks around. He looks crazy, looks like someone you could like point out of a group, but that's not the case.
Right.
These people are sociopath. You can't identify them just by looking at them. A lot of times they seem pretty normal, and they are actually pretty intelligent when it comes to making a connection with someone that they're trying to target.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. There's no one profile of a trafficker because there's different types of traffickers. But really, one thing that is very clear is that traffickers across the board lack empathy, right? Because they are forcing someone or coercing or manipulating or inducing someone to perform sexual acts for their oftentimes financial benefit.
Right.
But their actual sociodemographic profiles really run the gamut. So it could be a mother who has a drug addiction, and we hear about this in the news. A mother takes her 2 children, to a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, to go and have sex with her drug dealer so that she can get drugs. We hear about stories like that. Of course, we hear about, random men who befriend. And, this is kind of a side note, but I remember talking to a friend who does direct service, and she said she showed up to a court hearing and she saw this guy. And she was like, dang, that guy is cute. And then when she actually, everything was starting and people were sitting down, she realized that was the trafficker. And so, it's not this weird, in a, sociopath who's in this dark dungeon, and people will obviously clearly know that there's something wrong with that person. It really could be, their profile could be anyone. I think, unfortunately, and we didn't talk about language, but I'll bring it up in a little bit. I really don't like using the term pimp when we talk about a trafficker, because it automatically forces people to think that all traffickers are Black men. And we know that that's not true. But we know also that federal cases oftentimes are going to prosecute Black men more often. And so again, racism, juvenile justice, criminal justice, all these systems that are inherently and systemically racist, oftentimes we also see that narrative of all traffickers are quote unquote pimps and all pimps are Black men. And that's also not true, right? Because a trafficker could be a female. Mostly they are men, but it could be a female, a woman, could be a transgender folks. It could be really any type of composition and identity of a person.
Yeah, this is where education comes into play. If you just watch, TV, movies, you'll see that image of a pimp, and you'll see an African-American man. Maybe 20 years ago, he would be dressed, 30 years ago, he would be dressed in a bright suit or something. And that's what you connect. But it's so much deeper than that is what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think, if we only see traffickers as Black men, then we're lazy, because that's an inaccurate representation. And, it's really steeped in racism. We need to look beyond that, because a lot of traffickers are white also. They are, of different races and ethnicities, and also sex buyers. I think that we don't talk about sex buyers enough, but honestly, sex buyers drive this market. They wouldn't be an industry if there weren't people buying it, right? Right. Yeah. And so, we hear this, I hate to say this, but people say all the time, oh, it's a basic supply and demand type of thing. I don't like to distill it down to that because it's people's lives. But the reality is that, sex buyers are the people who are online looking to buy sex, driving around on their lunch breaks, looking for people standing in the streets, right? And they're not often asking if the person that they're buying sex from or a blowjob from is consenting, right? Like consent isn't part of the conversation, whatever. There's this idea, and there's research that shows that oftentimes people who buy sex, the moment that the money is transferred from their hand to the other person, it's like something switches and they think, I own this person for this next hour and I could do whatever I want. And they might play out pornography scenes. They might do devious things that their partners at home would typically not do, and oftentimes do it to children, right? And so it's so deep and complex, but at the same time, it's not, because we're not focusing the conversation. Like if we're always only talking about the traffickers and we're only talking about people who are victimized, then this entire body of people are allowed to continue doing what they're doing and going untouched.
Right. I mean, when we talk about exploitation, this is another topic that we discussed even before the podcast started, and racism. Could you explain what we were discussing earlier when it pertains to that, please?
Yeah, I think, just the broader idea of racism is embedded in sexual exploitation.
Okay.
Right? Like if we know that most people who are being exploited are people of color, and we seem to also have some data, although data is competing, that most purchasers of sex are actually white men. Mm-hmm. And we also know that people who purchase sex have this idea of, I now own you for this period of time and you have to do what I want you to do. We can't not also recognize that there's probably racist thoughts and acts happening. So, one of the things that we were talking about is there's this news article of this young woman. At the time she was 23 years old. It was a third pornography. It just came out, the third porn that she had ever done. And she goes to the place, and basically it's like a gangbang, and there's like 8 white men, all of them in Confederate flag kind of paraphernalia, whether it's shirts, hats, I don't remember. And she's a black woman. And so, that is a very visual representation of objectification and taking ownership of a black person's body and representing racism. But it's not always that explicit, right? Like, and it doesn't have to be that explicit to know and understand that racism is embedded in exploitation.
But not every form of exploitation is racist.
Right. No,
okay.
No. I mean, and we have to be critically thinking about what we're seeing. And oftentimes we don't talk about racism in the ways that it is embedded, or sexism and how it's embedded, or, all of these things that are also part of the conversation. Like, we can't just water it down and say, like, no, that was just a sex act. Well, if everyone there is wearing Confederate flags and this person is a black person, then yes, we can call out the fact
we can
that
take
it's
that
racist.
extra step. We can take that extra step.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. At this point in the conversation, we're going to take a short break. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Cube LA podcast.